All right. Hopefully this will be the third time's the charm with this Facebook one. Um, I have done this before. I know it's possible. I know it is possible. It says viewers can request to join. We're going to talk with Angela Hughes about writing like fiction versus non. She wants to join me on video. Okay, we are going to click approve, send invite. It says it's adding her, but this is what I did the last time. And yes, that was the problem. It was just the direction. That was the problem. Although last time it told me you can't add people if it's in a certain direction or not in a certain direction. And this time it didn't tell me that. So,
well, yay, we did it. I was like, I've always done through StreamYard or Facebook. Yeah. And I'm like, I have no idea how to join Facebook Live. So we did it, though. We figured it out.
Thank you for figuring that out with me and bearing with me through our 3 attempts. I think I deleted all the wrong attempts, so hopefully that worked out just fine. But thanks for coming on and chatting with me. I thought it would be fun to chat with our Facebook friends here, and then also we can I can take this video once we're done with it and put it on YouTube to help people understand a little bit more about what we like to write about. So yeah. Well, I read your book this summer. Actually, I read 2 of your books, and I'm waiting for your third one. I know you're working on getting beta readers for that one soon, so I'm excited. But this is Angela's book. She has it in the background, and I think it's in the back too. It's a massive book. I've never written a book this big. I am so impressed how you did that. It's so great. That's probably one of, I think, the biggest things that I noticed with like the difference between maybe writing fiction and nonfiction was sometimes just the volume, right, and how much more time and effort goes into that. But I thought it would be cool if we started out talking before we jump into those differences. If you want to talk a little bit of how we got reconnected, 2 very old 20-year-old friends from 20 years ago.
It's crazy. The world is so small sometimes.
Yes. So you were about to release your second book, the sequel to Eleanor and the Songbird, and you were on Instagram, and I had someone follow me called I don't know if you used, I think it was, you used your Angela account. It wasn't your Eleanor Blue account. So and you looked very familiar to me, and I don't get many followers on Instagram. I'm not very heavily involved on there like I used to be with Facebook. So I remember seeing we had mutual friends, so I figured you were probably someone from church, right, from Westside, and someone from a long time ago. And so I was trying to look for pictures. I'm like, who is this person? And I had this memory of someone named Angela when I was 9. I think it was 9 years old, when we had come back from Bahrain. And I was like, I remember this woman. She was really fun. She would dance in the back. I was really drawn to her. I think she even helped me like get my prayer language one Sunday night while we were there. And I just remember feeling really inspired by just your creativity and the way that you expressed yourself in worship. And it was a really difficult time for me in the transition between leaving Bahrain abruptly and coming back to the States for a year. So it was just really cool to get to connect with someone, but I didn't know for sure. So I sent you a message and was like, are you so-and-so that used to go to West Side? And do you remember this at all?
Well, it was so crazy too, because I don't even remember, like, because I go through, because I'm just trying to build my author community. So I'll look up hashtag Christian authors, and I'll just start friending people to build my community. So I didn't remember even like clicking on your profile.
Yeah.
I mean, because again, I would have been like 21 years old, and
no way you would have remembered me.
And I did, once you connected, I had to like filter through my brain and be like, I know this person. Her face is familiar, but I had to really filter back. But I hadn't even intentionally friended you.
Yeah.
Like, because I knew you, just friending authors, and which is just so crazy, because you think of all of the millions of people that are on Instagram. And probably because we had friends that were familiar, you came up, and I friended you and you reached out to me, and it was so fun. It just seemed like a God moment, because you're like, wow, this person that I haven't seen in 20 years is reaching back out to me, and so much has happened in our lives, and we both happen to be authors.
I know. Of all the odds.
Right. And so it was a really neat thing when you started reaching out to me and we started having this conversation. The whole time I was just like, this is the coolest thing ever, to be connecting with this person. And it was like the memory, you know how at first it's kind of like a foggy memory, and then the more like conversation goes on, the more the memory becomes alive. And it's like, I do remember you, and all of these memories kind of came back to life of being in West Side and seeing you there.
Oh, that's
Which
cool.
honestly was such a precious time in my life, honestly. So it was incredibly awesome to have somebody from that time period of my life reach out to me, because it was such a pivotal time, just being 21 and kind of launching out into the world.
Yeah, I can imagine. I remember when I was 21. I think I was getting married. But it's a whole like different dynamic than versus being a mom now and an author. I think that's something that's really cool too, is that I don't know if you get this a lot now that you've written 2 books and almost 3, of just like, they're like, how did you do that? Like, it seems so mystified. Like the concept of writing a book seems so mystical, like almost undoable, or that's for like someone that is retired and has time to do something like that. But do you get any comments like that at all, and what do you typically say to those people?
Yes, I definitely do. And honestly, when I first started writing, I didn't really feel like I had the chops. I mean, when you think about, especially when you've never done it before, how many words it takes to fill up the page of a book, right? And then especially a fiction book, which generally is longer. And I just, honestly, I didn't even know if I could. But, you know, I had a word of the Lord that was very strong on me that I needed to try. So it was kind of one of those things, like I just decided I would try, and if I failed, at least I obeyed.
Yeah.
And honestly, it's amazing what happens when you partner with God and you start writing a story. And it was amazing. It all came out. In fact, my first book, is still very, very thick. It ended at 160,000 words. And the original version before editing was over 190,000 words. So you imagine.
Oh my goodness.
And so by the end, you're like, wow, I can write that many words. There is that much storytelling in me. And I think there's gifting that comes along with the calling. And I even saw a post that you put earlier today or yesterday, but kind of understanding that it's a calling and not a hobby. So then trusting the process of going through it, and letting the story develop and grow from there. But it is a talent. It's like, you know, learning how to dance or playing the violin. You can learn how to do it. Everybody can. But there's also gifting and talent that can come along with it that gives it wings. And
That's a good way to describe it.
I discovered I had a gifting as I began to write that did give it wings. And it was, you know, it produced, you know, now 3 novels.
Yes, it's so cool. I love Lavon's on here. She's like, how is this happening? She knows both of us. Lavon Alvey. You'll have to go back and watch the replay, Lavon, and see that we just talked about how we reconnected. It was so wild. Another West Side friend. But yeah, so 3, I think I get that a lot too, mostly because like my kids are younger, right? And so I know your kids are in like the young teen, almost teen age, right? So but between homeschooling this, and it's nice when you like, I've been booking interviews for my 3rd book now, and so one of the people I'm interviewing was like, how do you know what you're doing in October already? Because I gave them a bunch of dates and I had to sit down and figure it out. And I think that's one of those things where like anything you do as a mom has to be intentional and planned, and you find your pockets of time. You find your little
be
pockets
intentional.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I love what Mike Bickle says. He said, if you don't take hold of your time, then the enemy will run away with it.
Oh,
and
I like that one.
you know, especially when you recognize that you've got something you're meant to do, like writing a book. And the significance of words is huge. It's a big deal to write a book. It's a big deal to produce anything that has God's kingdom heart attached to it. And so it's something that should be done. And so for me, I had to like take a hold of my own time, especially when I first started reading. You know, my son is 14 now, but when I started writing my book, he was 10, you know, so you think at that age. And so I had to go, well, in the evening when they go to bed, and my kids are good sleepers. So I have to say I was a little blessed there. You know, they go to bed, they sleep It was great. It was easy. But I literally just had to put down the remote and tell myself, I don't care if you're tired, you're just going to write. And I took a hold of my time, and 4 or 5 times a week, I would sit in my little chair, my little rocker chair, and write every single night until the book was done. And I didn't allow myself any excuses. And I think, again, when you think of something as a hobby instead of a calling, it's so easy to be like, I don't really feel like doing it.
Yeah.
And let it go. And I didn't give myself that option. I still don't, because I still believe it's important, and I've got more books to write.
Yeah. That I was going to ask you about that. Are you already thinking past like this 3 trilogy? Because now we're talking about how like, yeah, I'm going to just obey and see what happens. But now you've done 3 books. And so, and your perspective is shifting, kind of similar. Mine is kind of shifted too. Of like, now I've done 3 books. I can't just be like, you know, it was an experiment at first because I had some of those similar prophetic words and I knew I should do it at some point. But then I'm like, no, this is what I do now. This is part of who I am, or something that the Lord has put in my life, and I want to steward that well, versus just like, oh, it's a hobby, which sometimes can feel like a little bit of a cop out too, where it makes other people feel better because they feel intimidated. I think sometimes I get intimidated by what I've done. And then I start to feel insecure too, of like, maybe I shouldn't have done all that. Maybe I'm missing something, you know? But now I'm losing my train of thought here. But when you've shifted your focus too, of like, this is something I'm going to keep doing. And so, past these 3 books, what kind of are you thinking? Are you think you're going to keep going on the fiction line, or?
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing what happens when you say yes to God, how much transformation happens. And so for me, saying yes to God, I transformed and became an author. And I wasn't at the beginning, but writing the first book. And I remember, even because I knew it was a trilogy to begin with, so I knew I had to at least finish the 3 books. And I remember finishing the first book going, can I even do this again? Can I even write another book? Like, I still didn't really have the trust in my ability to write. It was growing.
Yeah.
But definitely by the end of book 2, I was there. I'm like, this is my best favorite thing that God has ever called me to do. I could see my original design just springing forth. And as I was in the middle of writing book 2, other stories started knocking on the back of my imagination. And I was almost like, hold on a minute. You know, I had to like
Don't do 2 things at once.
And, you know, I think there was a part of me, because I enjoyed the writing process so much, that I hoped more stories would come, but I didn't know if they would, you know, because I had this one, you know, trilogy that I had to get out. And I said, when it's done, do I get to keep writing? Are there more stories that will come? And I didn't know, because it seemed a miracle when the first one came. And lo and behold, I've got at least 3 stories sitting on in the back of, waiting to just be written. And I honestly can't wait to get book 3 done and in the publishing process, because I have another book that I am just chomping at the bit to start writing.
That's exciting. Yeah. Do you feel, let's talk a little bit about like kind of that different process between, you know, writing fiction versus nonfiction. When I was a kid, that's what I thought I would do when I first got those like prophetic words. I was like, oh, I'm going to do like C.S. Lewis, Lord of the Rings, that kind of stuff. You know, like that's just what a 12-year-old thinks of, you know, because what else does a 12-year-old have to talk about? But, when I jumped into it, I started with nonfiction, and the first 2 books were very, very much, I think I was trying to figure this out because you introduced me to that Kingdom Writers Association, and you were talking on that one of that first calls I listened into about like why, like your why behind writing. I'm like, what is it? All 3 of my books have felt so different. But there is a thing where there's a lot of other people's stories in it. It's not just me talking. Each book that I've written has been other, like even the first one, I did a huge survey of like a bunch of other third culture kids, at least 40 of them, and used some of their stories in that book, which was about third culture kids and growing up overseas and how to understand those people. And then the second one was about like toxin free stuff. So total different like thing, but I use people's stories and their testimonies of making changes in their lifestyle and habits. And so each chapter starts with someone else's story. Yes. And then this third one, which is done the best, the Becoming Jesus People one, is literally just everybody else's stories. It's not my story at all. Except for a little bit in the introduction. I think I mentioned myself and my own awe of these stories. But And so I noticed, like, I have this theme here of telling people stories and kind of bringing to light, and into the focus of like the general public some of these stories that may never be heard about other than one-on-one conversations otherwise. And with the third book, I definitely switched styles of writing into more of that storytelling style, right? A first person perspective. I smell this, there's like sand in my socks, from the Sahara Desert, in chapter 6 with my co-author's story of hitchhiking across the Sahara Desert. And so that's a whole different style for me to write from that kind of perspective. Yeah. But it's still nonfiction, right? So it has to stay true to the facts. Like, you can't like imagine too much more than like maybe something they were smelling or feeling, because they may not remember 50 years ago what they were actually smelling. Right. But I need to tell the writer what they're smelling to help immerse the writer in that. But with like a fiction book like yours, you get to kind of create like create a whole world, and different characters. And so can you tell me a little bit about that process for you?
Well, again, I never considered myself a writer and author when I first started, but previous to that, I'd always been a creative. I was an artist, and always have I been a fantasy nerd. Like, I will fly that fantasy nerd flag so proudly, because it really is something I've always loved. Like you said, C.S. Lewis, George MacDonald, J.R.R. Tolkien, like those kind of stories gave me just breath in my lungs. I loved stories like that. I love movies like that. I just, and there's so few stories out there, especially, as time goes on, where you can find one that has good content in it that isn't, unclean. And again, for me starting to write, there wasn't this like, I've always wanted to be an author, or I've dreamed of being an author, or I've always wanted to write a story. It was like this story, which I'd always been a storyteller. So again, it's one of those things where you don't realize what you've always done until you're doing it and you go, oh my gosh, I've always been this way. But I used to, as a child, sit with my headphones on, listening to record players, because that's what we had when I was a kid. And I would put on the E.T. soundtrack and the Indiana Jones soundtrack on the record player, and I would just listen. And I could sit there for hours. Now, I was a really highly energetic child, but music would calm me down, and I would listen. And stories, I could do it for hours. Stories, just let stories run through my head. And then I would tell my friends the stories. And I would just, and then even as a preacher, I would tell stories. Like, I loved telling stories. So when this story came, it was very much something that I naturally had a lean to. So even, my husband and I were pastors for a long time, and I went to Bible school. And in Bible school, my reward was, if you get through this academic Bible teaching book, then you get to read a fiction book. So that was my reward. Like, you do your homework, then you get to have some fun. So there was always this reward with more stories, more books that I got to read. I loved to read. And so when this story came to me, though, there was a lot that needed to be unlocked to think that I could do it. There's too much assumption in me that writers were something other than what I was. And lo and behold, I'm good at it. Like, I'm good at it. So for me, I don't know. I started, honestly, actually, this just popped into my head. Before this story came into my mind, I was writing a book, though for me, it was a lot of hard work and it wasn't fun for me. I was writing a book called Realms of the Imagination. And it was a book about hearing God through your imagination. And how God inspires creativity and artists and all of those kinds of things. And it was a teaching book based off of teachings that I had done, kind of more like your books. It wasn't necessarily fiction, but I didn't have fun writing that book. God may bring me back to writing that book someday, but I think what's so fantastic, at least in the writing process of writing a fiction book, is I get to play the best game of pretend that I could ever play as an adult. That is my writing process, is I get into that world. I invite the Holy Spirit, and I get to play pretend, and I get to write it all down, and I get to share it with other people. And I think that's a lot different than when you're writing a book that's a memoir, or a book that you're writing that's more journalism, or a teaching book, or a book that's educating people. You can, as a memoir, you're getting into your past, and so you are entering into those memories, but it engages your imagination to write fiction, and it gives you permission to explore in a way that you don't get to do as an adult, but you do as a child. And so that was kind of an extraordinary discovery for me, because that's what I always love to do.
Yeah, I think I picked up a couple things in your and maybe it was kind of a little bit of an overarching theme between the first and the second one, where Eleanor is working through some of her own insecurities and wrestling with that kind of mental battle of her identity in some places. And I thought it was really cool how with fiction you get to explore some of those things, you know, that maybe in a teaching book you can teach somebody like how to overcome some sort of insecurity or something like that, but to watch a character kind of experience it and go through it themselves has in its own way some teaching model and communicating certain spiritual principles that I thought you did a really cool job of integrating into your storyline. So I'm assuming you intentionally put some of that in there because I know your faith, but
yeah, you know, I did, and I think that's kind of the power of storytelling, right? You know, that's where C.S. Lewis more specifically really impacted a generation with Language in the Wardrobe and Into the Silent Planet series. If you haven't read any of those science fiction books from C.S. Lewis, they're pretty fantastic. But you know, so I am a Christian, and I don't separate myself when I write my stories. I write my stories not creating necessarily Christian stories, but I am a Christian writer. You know what I mean? So what I produce is kingdom. And what was interesting about when I was writing my books is it gave me a way to be honest and tell a story in a really unique way, in a way that kind of went beyond people's maybe triggers or walls that they had up. I could tell them true things about the nature of God. I could tell them true things about what it is to wrestle with having identity. I could bring in real encounters and experiences that I've had with the Lord in a fantastical setting. And I could also even, what I like what Bray Wyckoff says, he says, you plunder the darkness so that you can reveal the gold. So there were a lot of dark areas in my own past, hurts, pains, lack of identity, that I got to be really honest and raw about, and I couldn't do it without allowing the Lord to heal me so the gold would shine through. So if you read my book, there's a lot of darkness in the midst of my characters. I mean, like, people will come to me and say, is it okay for my kids to read your books? And I'm like, well, you know, you might want to read it first because there is magic and there is darkness. And I put it there on purpose because it highlights the gold, because I have been healed and come out on the other side. So I get to let that darkness come. And, you know, one of the biggest obstacles of my book, and it is kind of me getting on a podium and preaching, what happens at the worst possible scenario, when every prophetic dream, when everything that's been promised to you has been completely obliterated? How do you trust? How do you hope again? What do you do when you're someone who doesn't believe in themselves, but you're thrust into a place where people are telling you have promise, but you can't believe it yourself? And just kind of inserting my own journey and the things that I know of God and the things that I know of, you know, the Holy Spirit, when he's taught me, I get to insert that into my characters, even though when you read my stories, you know, my characters are maybe encountering something, but they don't know God, you know, so they're going on this journey kind of on the outside, being invited into that wisdom and truth. And so for me, there is the opportunity, like, I can't detach who I am from what I'm writing. And I've always been a preacher at heart.
Yeah.
And I've always been someone who, you know, especially when I read those wise truths, when you read a book from C.S. Lewis or something, you're like, it's like those little nuggets, those gems that people can chew on and on, that hopefully bring them freedom and victory. I hope that by the end of this book, people who've experienced trauma and grief can come to the other side of this and go, there is something else on the other side of the worst.
And I think that was really cool, and especially in your first book too, where you highlighted. Hopefully, it's not getting scratchy when I come through, but it sounds scratchy in my earphone.
I don't hear you
But
scratch.
okay, it's just my headphone, which is getting really old. But you kind of highlight that grief piece in the beginning. I'm glad you brought that up, because I thought that was really anyone that's gone through grief and just tragedy will resonate with that, you know. And writing fiction and books like the ones that you're doing has a way of connecting to a reader in a way that's different than, like you said, those teaching books or things that are focused on like teaching this or that to somebody on how to go through that process. But sometimes just watching another character, it's almost like when you sit down with a friend in a difficult season and your friend says, let me tell you my story, you know, and you're like, okay, I'm not so alone. You know. But I thought you just really beautifully crafted just the repercussions of someone that wallows in grief, to their friends and the people that pick up and keep going on. I thought that was a really just well done scene and story arc that you implanted in there. And then you see in the second one how they've come out of that, and there's a different character working on their stuff. And so I'm excited to see what comes in the third book and what happens in that one. It'll be really cool.
Yeah, I'm excited about the third book. It's probably the roughest of the three. I think it's the climax. It's the grand finale, you know, without it giving any spoilers. But it does definitely, in the third book, it really brings in all of those things, the pieces from the first book, you know, with identityless and grief. You know, we all get healed, but sometimes every now and then, all of those things that we thought we dealt with try to rear their head again.
Yes.
And so in this book, my characters, did they really learn it? Did they really overcome? Can they really, in the face of? And then again, there's the idea of, is God good even when the dead aren't raised and people aren't healed and the worst comes again? And that's a hard lesson for a lot of people, especially as Christians, because we believe God and we believe that he is good, and he is, but sometimes we put that on our human level of understanding. And so my characters really have to face like, oh, what if God doesn't come through? Can I still trust in all of the things that I've learned? Can I still believe that it was worth it? Is there something else beyond what I'm seeing with my eyes that makes this all worth it? And so there's some really, really hard, grungy truth that I really rub pretty hard in book 3. And I do it on purpose because, you know, I think one of the things that has always been hard for me to watch in my life is when people's faith is faltered because of something bad that's happened to them. Or if their faith falters because of a mistake somebody made, because their trust was more in humans than God himself. And so you see that theme that repeats in a lot of people's life, even in my own life, you know, losing friends who shouldn't have died, you know, things like that, when you're like, God, this shouldn't have happened. You heal. You always heal. It's your heart to heal. I believe that, right? But what happens when healing doesn't come? The friend dies. Is God still good? Does God still heal? And the answer is yes. Yes, he does. But really kind of allowing the ugly to get ugly, and seeing what happens, like with my characters and everything that begins to collide with dragons and the undead and all of the fun things that I get to wrap into the package of this story to make it even more fun to read.
Yeah, that sounds really cool. I'm more excited now to read be one of your beta readers and read that. I'm excited to see what you do with that. It's really cool. It reminds me too of a conversation I had when we were doing a big group interview for this last book I did, and I had to encourage the people that I was interviewing. It was like, it's okay to tell the gritty ugly stuff, because that's what's going to really connect to people. And sometimes, and I don't know if sometimes it's we've tried to like, well, that was my past, you know, that was my past, that happened before I knew Jesus, or someone might interpret it wrong, or someone may think of it as like you know, there's a story of abortion in my third book, someone that had an abortion. went really terribly wrong, you know, and had a hysterectomy. And so this is back in like the 70s. So before Roe versus Wade. So but it was just, I was just so proud of them for letting me tell that part of their story.
Yes.
And how it affected them in their life, and how it actually was a catalyst into their relationship with Jesus later, you know. And so, like, some of those things that we feel like, you know, I know some Christian fiction is all like, you know, it stays super clean, like it stays in a box, right, of like this or this. But and there's another author friend, I've never met them, but we've been connected over line since I wrote this third book. And they recently wrote, is it Eric Wilson? The Wilson siblings wrote American Leftovers, about their family story. And they're very nitty gritty. And there was a lot of Christian publishers. They had a very hard time finding a publisher that would publish their book, because they included a lot of that stuff of just the trials as teenagers and the stuff they were going through. And they didn't sugarcoat it. And so sometimes I think there's a lot of power to sharing the difficult, hard, dark parts of the story, when you can tell it from a healed perspective, and with a story arc at the end where it shows like redemption and conquering through those difficult trials. Because sometimes we sugarcoat our lives, or we only show the Facebook or Instagram version of it. And so, but when you see people, that's a lot of the power of the story. A story, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, is when someone overcomes their fear, where someone overcomes something really dark, and someone walks through something really, really hard and comes out the other side, maybe with some scrapes and tears, but still whole and a whole person, and with strength on the other side of it. So I think that's something really cool about the written word and sharing stories, is that you can be an encouraging presence in someone's life that maybe you wouldn't have otherwise, because the stories are just so powerful.
They really are. And, you know, there's all different reasons why we write, you know, like, you know, the whole Hallmark version of storytelling, that's feel good. There's a reason for that storytelling. Sometimes you just want to watch a movie or read a book that is not going to traumatize you. That's just easy to read, and you know it's going to have a happy ending. You know that from the start, you know, but this book or this movie that you're watching is because you want to feel good. You know, it just, that's all. Non-complicated, it's typical, it's
predictable,
gonna have all the that are predictable, and you know what's going to happen next, and that's okay. That's a good form of storytelling. It serves a purpose. But for me personally, I especially don't want just to make impact with people who are Christians. I want to make impact for people who aren't. And I'm not trying to speak their language, but I also can't forget that just because I'm a Christian, that I'm not human. And one of the things that I really strove hard to do with my characters is make them talk like real people. You know, no, there's no golly gosh in my book. You know, I remember I had to wrestle with one of my editors. They're like, you have a swear word here, and I'm not sure this is okay. And I'm like, no, listen, this character, this is how they would speak. And there's, you know, different levels, you know, as to why we make certain decisions that we do, and we submit those all to the Holy Spirit. But I needed my characters to be like real life human beings, you know, real life human beings that aren't perfect, that say things, that do things that aren't perfect, experience real life darkness, because real life darkness does exist. And as a storyteller, I discovered just how nitty gritty I really am. And I had to come to a place where I trusted the Lord with that, like where the Lord was like, no, I want you to be nitty gritty. I want it to be okay, you know, to be bloody and bad and harsh, and for your characters to talk like characters really would talk in those kinds of situations. Like in book 2, without spoiling anything, we're in modern day. So we're in Arthurian legends, 6th century time zone. And then in book 2, we're back in the future. And one of my characters, he's kind of like a gangly street kid, you know, and he's not going to say, gosh, golly darn, you know, like he's going to have a little bit more grit to the way he talks. And, you know, I didn't go, you know, as far as I needed to with his language, but I also wasn't going to make him Hallmark. And because I needed him to be a real person that, you know, we would have encountered in the world, and not worry so much about offending all of my Christian readers. when this is a character that I needed people who maybe aren't Christian to relate to. So, but those are decisions that I make based off of the type of storyteller that I believe I'm created to be, and the people groups that I'm meant to reach. And I'm both and. Like, I feel like I'm meant to reach both a Christian audience and a non-Christian audience. And there are some writers, it's like just a Christian audience that they're reaching for. And if they are, they really do need to watch their P's and Q's, because they don't want to turn that audience off. I have author friends who are just trying to reach the lost and talk about nitty gritty, you know, and we could talk theology and what's right and wrong, you know, maybe some other time. But I have Christian friends who are writing horror books specifically to reach the lost, the people who would read a horror book and they wouldn't pick up, you know, maybe something that I've written, or, you know, a teaching book, or a lighter feeling book. And so they do have their place. I don't need to write stories like that. That's not necessarily what I'm called to do, but I do think it does have its place. And so kind of understanding like your identity as a storyteller and how, and I had to invite the Holy Spirit in the whole time. Like, is it really okay for me to say this? And there were times where I felt like the Lord's like, go deeper, go darker. It's okay. And I was like surprised to hear that, you know, because that's not always what you expect to hear.
Yeah. I think it's a really key thing when you're writing with the Holy Spirit, because versus just based on your knowledge of what a Christian book should be like, or I am a Christian author, I identify as a Christian author, so I need to write like this, or this. But what is the Holy Spirit telling you, and who, and exactly, I love that you brought up the point of like, who is your audience, because I absolutely agree. There is an audience for your Hallmark, you know, Janet Oakes, you know, novels and things like that. And then you've got, was it Francine Rivers, who did Redeeming Love? That's like a whole different genre in some ways. And she gets a little bit grittier, you know, but it appeals to a different audience. And so knowing who you're called to write for and who you're called to write to, and who your target audience is really key. And then partnering with the Holy Spirit in those moments so that it's a collaborative process versus just this is what I think I'm supposed to do and this is what I'm going to do, is really important. Yeah.
Is, I mean, it's like just like anything, you know, whether you're writing a book or you're preaching from the pulpit or you're doing evangelism, there is usually a people group. At least it's always been like that for me, that I felt pulled to or called to. You know, whether it's, you know, going out into the missions field or feeding, you know, the homeless and the hungry and the destitute, or single moms, or you know, and my people group has always kind of been the you know, the fantasy nerd groups, you know, kind of those on the fringe, people who, you know, are kind of going on, you know, both sides of the spectrum of spirituality that need to be introduced to Jesus. And it's always been that way for me. I've always been passionate about reaching that people group. And so it's interesting now that God has me writing books, because that's just, you know, a really good language to really begin to minister to that kind of people group. And so I have to keep that in mind when I'm writing these stories, why, who I'm called to and why I'm writing them.
Yeah, I thought it was really cool too in your series where you, most Christian, you know, fantasy or science fiction, I've always seen it like Ted Decker, for instance, usually has like a replacement figures for like Jesus and God in the story, you know, like, so they create this whole, you know, story and world that's a mirror of what we're doing, but just replaces those things, right? And I thought it was really interesting where because you've described yourself as a historical fantasy writing, where you were kind of pulling in like a historical element and leaving these breadcrumbs of like, there has been this religion, you know, that they've been believing in, and the Druids and stuff, but there's something else that there's new truth that's coming into place, and they're discovering that and figuring it out. And I thought that was a very creative new way of bringing in like truth into a fantasy story that I hadn't seen before. I thought it was really cool.
I'm so passionate about fantasy, like you said, just like stories that are other, you know, from another world. But I am almost as equally as passionate about history. And that's why I love mythology and legend, because it's like fantasy coupled with history. And my favorite time of history is that time when, you know, you had Rome just leaving the British Isles, and you had this wave of Christianity that hit a lot of these really pagan people groups of Ireland and the old Welsh Celtic groups. And it's a really interesting piece. So you would imagine, you know, with St. Patrick and St. Columba and all of these people coming in, that these people they didn't have like the internet. They wouldn't have been hit with this idea of like how they should talk or what they should know, like this, but this wave of newness, this new way was coming in and changing their reality, especially after Rome left and they were kind of left, kind of abandoned by a military force as the Saxons were continuing to invade. You know, this is a very vulnerable time in history. And yet during that time in history is where St. Patrick comes and lights up Ireland. And it was it's funny, I read this article about Druids, and just previous to writing this book, so I kind of mixed this into my story because this is really what happened in history, where, you know, you had different sects of Druidism, where you had those who, they all kind of believed in this magic of nature, but you had those that believed in a triple god, and they had kind of this, they were waiting for something that was coming. They were waiting for this god that was going to teach them. It was the triple god that was coming, and that's why a lot of things in Ireland and in Celtic myth are in threes, because there was this triple god. Well, it became the triple goddess, right? And over time it changed, but there was this triple god. But there were the Druids that would really fall into darkness and do, you know, dark Druidic practices. Well, when God hit the scene, Jesus hit the scene, and you had St. Patrick coming in, bringing the fire of Christianity, and all this was happening, you had a large amount of Druids who went, this is what we've been waiting for. Wow. This is the triple God. This is who has been prophesied to us would come. And so they easily just went that direction, but it took a long time before they stopped calling themselves Druids, because they didn't believe that what they had been doing was necessarily pagan. They just kind of moved who they were towards this God. And that's why
that believe in Jesus.
Yeah, right. And that's why during that time period, you had a lot of monks and priests who still performed a lot of signs and wonders, because they hadn't been taught that they shouldn't yet. You know what I mean? That canonization hadn't come, that kind of brought the religious spirit and stopped all that. So you had a lot of fire. And so my characters in my story are in that transitional time where they've heard from these monks from Ireland. They've got this new way and this new God. They don't really necessarily all have the revelation that it's Jesus yet. But something new has come, and it's something they've been waiting for. And in the middle of that, it split the Druids in half, and you see one side really going dark and separating themselves entirely and resisting the change, whereas you have a whole bunch who are like slowly coming closer into the revelation of what it is that's changed and who it is who's come. And so that was kind of fun for me, because I have fantasy in my book, but it's also based off a real true time in history and kind of the cataclysmic shift of Christianity during that time. And that's part of the reason I just love that part of history so much. It changed the world. Like that was a really huge, impactful time in history that really changed the face of Europe. So see, I'm getting into my history nerdness.
I think it's so cool.
It was fun.
Because I part of me was like, how much is she crafting this, and how much is this based on, like, you know, some actual history? Because I knew you loved the historical piece too. So that is fascinating to me. I think that's so cool. And I think there's so many, like, even like in the Bible where it has the three wise men, they were getting there's something here that we need to know about. We need to go investigate this star. Like, it was happening worldwide. I'm sure of it, you know? And so it's just the Lord was preparing the whole world for that coming of his son. And so it's so cool to see that storyline in there. And I love the historical context. Thank you for sharing that. It's so fun.
It was fun to get to put in there.
Cool. Is there any other thoughts you have about, like, kind of that difference between writing Christian fiction versus just writing fiction, or writing nonfiction? I think a lot of people that might watch this would be Audra says she loves the history nerdness. Is there anything else you might want to share? I think a lot of our the people that might view this on Facebook that are connected to me or you, or also when I put it up on YouTube later, might be be themselves deciding, what do I want to write something. I feel I'm in the process of writing something, but I'm not sure where to start. I'm not sure which direction to go. I had this idea. Because I'm like with you. As soon as I wrote the first one, I was like, I've got like all these different ones in my brain. But now it's like a timing thing. And I'm still my homeschool mom, so I have to pace myself.
That's real. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I would have to say, if there's something in you to write, then it's meant to be written. And I think we waste a lot of time wondering, is it me? Am I supposed to write it? Is it really that important? Does God really think it's that important? And I feel like, well, if it's in you, then it's important. If there's even the desire, a little desire, like, oh, I'd like to write this someday, you should do it. And I think there are a lot of Christians that struggle with the barrier lines of fiction and fantasy, and if they're allowed, I hear a lot of people, they're like, well, I want to read fantasy, but they almost feel like they're not being godly if they're reading fantasy instead of reading all the teaching books that exist out there, and I'm like, stories are meant to be enjoyed, and even stories that aren't necessarily specifically written by Christians can still impact you and teach you something. And so, having a good balance. But I would say what really hinders people sometimes from just obeying and beginning to start writing is perfectionism and the feeling that they're not qualified or that they're being pretentious to even believe. And I would say that's the real thing that needs to be knocked down by just giving it a shot and trying it and not giving up, because I think we'd be amazed. One of the things stories I always like to tell, I don't know if you know who Carissa Gobble is, but she is, if you go to Bethel, her husband actually.
Oh, yeah. The treasure hunt. They did the treasure hunt books, right?
Yes. Yeah. They're now further in Southern California doing their own ministry, but, they hold the School of Creativity, and she, equips a lot of painters to paint. And there was this gal who was kind of being mentored by Carissa Gobble, and she'd always wanted to paint. But she, as far as she was concerned, she'd never done it. She hadn't even really drawn a picture that much. She didn't have the chops. She couldn't paint, but she always wanted to. And Carissa said, just start and see what God does. Because here's the thing, we have to trust that if God's given us a desire to do something, that he can actually add to us the ability to.
Yeah.
And so she was funny. This gal was sharing her testimony in our church, and she showed her first painting, and it made us all laugh. And she did that on purpose, because it was like this puffy pink unicorn that was kind of like a bubble stick figure. And it was, it was funny because it did look like something that a child probably had painted. She's like, this is what I can do. And she just started painting, and she said, then she showed the next painting. It had been 6 months since she had painted that pink unicorn. And 6 months later, she shows this absolutely beautiful painting, realistic painting of a peacock that is hyper detailed, absolutely gorgeous. She goes, I don't know how I went from here to here. All I know is that I started doing something that I've always wanted to do, and I believe God added unto me the gifting and the calling. And I think if the desire's in there, the gifting can come. I think there's always, again, you learn to play the violin, you got to learn what the notes are. You got to, even when I started writing, I still had to learn some skill level stuff. I had to learn really, really quickly. And I did. And I was capable, but I had to learn quick, and what needed to be done to tell a story. There were so many things I maybe didn't do right the first draft, but I learned to do it the second and the third draft. And now, as a writer on the third book, I don't make those same mistakes anymore, because I've been playing a violin now for 4 years, and the skill and the gifting has really amplified. But I would just say, push down all those hindrances that are making you feel like you're pretentious, or you're not qualified, or you're not invited into the world, or that you can't, because you really can. And it's, if the lies are really coming after you that strongly, I know when I first started to write, the voices were so loud. What are you doing? Who do you think you are? Nobody thinks that you can do this. And it was true. When I first started writing, nobody thought I could. And well, I can't say nobody, but there were people who were like, that's cute. You go, you go write your book. But they didn't believe it yet. I didn't believe it yet. And look what's happened over, the 4 years. I'm a totally different person. I'm a person who now coaches people to write fiction. And I'm a person who knows the publishing industry inside and out. And I'm going to be a writer forever, and will probably always write fiction unless God drops a nugget. And that's the thing. Asking, you've got a bunch of things on the shelf. Ask God, what's the nugget for now? What's the now piece that I'm supposed to be writing? And then don't get off of that train. Once you hear from him, don't get distracted. Don't go, oh, but I've got all these other things that I can do, because that happens so easily when you get bored with what you're writing. You get bored and you go, oh, I'd rather maybe start a different project.
There's always the hard days.
Recipe for disaster. You just stay on the course with that one thing that God said, this is the now, until it's done. And that's what I did. And, you know, it's really made a huge difference.
Yeah, that's awesome. I remember the thing that inspired me to like try self-publishing, because we probably didn't clarify this at the beginning, but we both self-published our books, and versus using the traditional publishing or like a hybrid publisher where they help you, but you're still keeping the royalties and stuff. So you don't have to like bid and get them to say, yes, I want to publish your book. And there's a bunch, and you were telling me when we were talking the last time of how there's a lot more of those types of things kind of popping up now too. And I remember when I was listening to Chandler Bolt at an entrepreneurship conference called 100X, and he has a self-publishing school.com. He's a Christian. And he said, write the first thing you want to write is the thing that you talk about the most. What is the thing that you're always talking about, you know? And so for you already love fantasy, you love historical fiction, you love, you know, you lived out there in, was it Ireland, right? Or Scotland? And so like that whole world is something that you were passionate about already. And it was a great training ground for you to practice this new skill set, new calling. And I remember, and that's what I did with my first book, is like, what do I talk about the most? What could I talk about the most? And it was about growing up overseas and that difference and how different we are. And I knew I had plenty of friends that could give me stories similarly. And so that's what I did, but it was very much an experiment. And I've even gone back and read my pieces out of my second book recently, because I did a workshop around it. And I was like, oh man, this is not so great. Some of the things I should have written this a little, just like some of the grammar pieces or the style that I took, it was a little bit more conversational style. I was like, I don't know if I still write. Do I still write that way? Maybe I do. I don't know. But you keep learning as you go, you know, and thankfully there's editors out there. There's actually a lot of resources out there that I didn't know about, you know, and I think a lot of people don't realize that you can hire somebody to edit. You can hire someone to make a book cover. You can hire someone to format your book. You can hire people to do these things. And they doesn't necessarily have to cost you a whole lot of money. I think it cost me like a total of maybe $300 to $350 for my first book.
Wow.
And then it made that back, you know, over a course of about a year, I think. And so for the second one, I spent a little bit more, because I understood a little bit more what I was doing. And part of why it was so cheap is I had a friend to design the cover really cheaply for me. It was like a labor of love for her, because she was a third culture kid. So if you have friends, you may have those friends in your world that would love to help you out. And so so there's a lot of great resources out there. And then having community, like I'm very much like, unlike your story where you were like, I don't know if I could do this. I knew I could. I was like, I can do this. I know I could get this. This is going to happen. And I think I did it in like 4 months. I was realistic though. Like I followed Chandler Bolt's self-publishing, his book published. I just read it and I just followed what he said to do in the book. But in his book, he said you could do it in 90 days. And this is for mostly nonfiction and not fiction. We're not talking fiction. So you could do it in 90 days, written to outline to publication, 90 days. And you totally, absolutely can. I did it. I knew I needed more because I was a mom. So I gave myself 4 months. And I think there's something helpful to having like a deadline too, if you're someone that procrastinates a lot or like you were saying, can get distracted easily. Having a deadline and telling people about it, that's going to help you stay accountable to that. There's
Without
a little bit more peer pressure. Like this is coming, and then it can't be pulled aside as easily when you have that. And I'm very much a self-motivated person, so I don't know if I didn't need as much of the community piece for the first one, but as I've gone along, and it's been really cool to connect with other authors like you and Eric Wilson, and kind of pick people's brains, because again, like you were saying at the beginning, it's switching from like this experiment or hobby to like, this is something I do. too. So I kind of want to be better at it and be, you know, professional with it. So what can I do to improve that? And getting around other people that are in that same space or a little bit farther ahead or a little bit behind, because sometimes what we learn a lot too by telling somebody else or explaining it to someone else and being able to articulate that can actually help ourselves learn too. So I love that Kingdom Writers Association that you are part of and introduced me to. That's really cool. I didn't know there was a community like that. So if you're someone too that is watching this and knows you're called to write something, or there's a story on your heart that needs to be written, then I would encourage you to find that community around you to help you, especially if you know you want someone that feeds off of other people and will need that encouragement along the way. So yeah, well, my kids are obviously needing something from me, so we're probably going to need to wrap this up. But any other final thoughts?
This has been fun, Carissa. We'll have to do it again.
Yeah, it'll be really fun to do. Okay, when we both have a next book out, we'll have to do it again. Thanks, Angela, for chatting with me and figuring out Facebook. I appreciate it a lot.
You're welcome.
Have a great rest of your day.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.